Tachale. Hello and welcome to A2C's podcast. I'm Dr. Zoë Bedford and I'm joined here today by Ms. Tenzin Dawa, the Executive Director of the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy. She's come from Dharamsala to Australia to speak about an important TCHRD report about transnational repression. Welcome to Australia.
Thank you, Zoe. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Can you start with telling us a little bit more about the work of the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy? What do you do and why do you do it?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Zoe. So the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy is a Tibetan human rights NGO. So we're based in Dharamsala in northern India. And it's actually one of the first Tibetan human rights NGOs to be established in exile. And our work is it is focused on monitoring and documenting human rights abuses in Tibet, and then also working to promote the principles of democracy in the exiled Tibetan community. So since a lot of the work is actually focused on research and documentation, we use these research reports to advocate for the Tibetan cause, engaging with the international community, especially with UN human rights mechanisms. So we regularly engage with UN special procedures and attend Human Rights Council sessions to highlight the cases of Tibetan political prisoners and the situation there. And alongside in the exile community, we also do a lot of rights-based awareness raising workshops, including on gender-related issues, women's empowerment, and rights of the child. So this is largely what we do at TCHRD in Dharamsala. Yeah.
Amazing work. And so I want to talk about quite a few aspects of that, but the first thing I thought we might talk about is how do you go about, collecting information for your reports? Like, I imagine it's quite difficult and potentially risky, to get information. Can you talk a bit more about that process and if it is indeed so risky and dangerous?
It is actually becoming more and more risky and challenging for us to be documenting human rights violations, specifically because Chinese government in recent years have increasingly been intensifying its approach in cutting off ties between Tibetans inside and outside. So that means making communication technically impossible for us to get information about human rights in Tibet, and also because of closing of its ties with countries like Nepal, which has been a safe passage for Tibetans to escape Tibet to come into exile. And through that route, we used to have Tibetans who escaped Tibet and then provide us information, first-hand information and testimonies of the situation there. So that has reduced dramatically and has been challenging for us to document real evidence-based information. And on the other hand, because today communication is reliant heavily on social media and on applications digitally, because of the surveillance and monitoring that is in place, it has made really difficult for people to send information. So it's getting more and more challenging in recent years. Yeah.
Amazing work that you do. I think there's a real balance that needs to be achieved here because, on the one hand, collecting information and people sending you information is really risky. There's a lot of, personal threats for them. But on the other hand, if Tibetans in Tibet feel so strongly that the world needs to know what's happening and they want to get the information out, then we also, as NGOs, have a responsibility, to make sure that if they're making this risk, then we can, try to disseminate the information. How do you go about reaching people who want to tell their stories or want to tell the world what's happening, if you can share that information? Yeah.
So it's definitely a lot of risk involved when someone tries to speak out about the situation there. Of course, people who have family members inside have been threatened in the past, intimidated, harassed on a regular basis, which makes it really difficult for them to speak out publicly, which is why also a lot of people are going into censoring themselves from speaking out, because something they might do outside of Tibet could jeopardize their family members inside, because Chinese government today has made collective punishment as a state policy that really, really makes it difficult for people inside to exercise their fundamental rights of expression, movement, peaceful assembly, because they go on to really undermining and really threatening their livelihood right? They would stop sending kids to school if they found out that someone outside have spoken up about the Tibetan issue, or if someone works in the government, they get demoted, they get fired because some of the activism they've done outside. So it's really, really difficult for them, and it's a lot about sacrifices, whether you speak out or not. So it's really, really difficult.
Yeah. And so Australia Tibet Council has worked with you to come here to Australia at the moment and to do some workshops talking about transnational repression. Can you go into some detail about, what is transnational repression? What is China doing? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think transnational repression generally is something that's becoming a new phenomenon globally. But for the Tibetan community, it is not new. I mean, we've been in exile for about 60 years now. And I think it's fair to say that Tibetans have been one of the first communities under China that has been affected and impacted by Chinese transnational repression. So how do we define transnational repression? I think it's important to highlight the fact that it's basically governments reaching across its borders to silence people in the diaspora against speaking out, criticizing its policies back home.
Yeah.
So for the Tibetans, I think the interesting thing to note is that for the Chinese government, their target for transnational repression against Tibetan communities in the past, maybe in the early 1980s or 1990s, would be His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for instance, or prominent leaders in the community, or the Tibetan NGOs, or the Central Tibetan Administration. But what happened post-2008 uprising that we saw in Tibet was that it drew a lot of global attention on China's image, right? Because China obviously always tell that people inside are happy, they've brought in a lot of development, but that sort of internal protest has been viewed as something that's not going well inside. So that the Chinese government at the time kind of viewed these internal protests as something that has been orchestrated or influenced by Tibetans in the diaspora. So I think that's been one of the catalysts for them to shift their targets from just targeting Tibetan prominent leaders to targeting ordinary Tibetans in exile. So that means post-2008, we saw an intensification of cutting off ties, an attempt from the Chinese government to cut off ties between Tibetans inside and outside. And which is why today we're seeing almost 80 to 90% of Tibetans who have family members inside have faced at least one form of transnational repression. So transnational repression, I think, is a spectrum of it involves a spectrum of tactics. It could involve physical intimidation, harassment, hacking, kidnapping, extraterritorial killing as well. So I think all of these phenomena, these tactics, have been used against Tibetan community for quite some time now. And in recent years, it's only intensifying at a pace that we are really concerned about here.
Well, I guess technology is coming along so much so that China would be getting much more sophisticated in how it can sort of try to monitor people internationally or find out things. Is that one of the things you're finding, that, technology is maybe a tool that can be used against Tibetans in Australia or other parts of the world? Yeah.
Well, I think social media today plays a huge role in not just carrying out transnational repression, including intimidation and hacking and creating disinformation in the community. I think it also helps repressive governments like CCP to monitor Tibetans more actively. So we have had cases of Tibetans in free countries, in Europe, for instance, in Australia, who've been monitored through their personal devices, being contacted by consulate officials, basically telling them that they're being watched and that they know who they are and that they need to be careful about speaking out or taking part in these protests in these free countries. So I think technology has been really used heavily by Chinese government to carry out transnational repression.
Just going back to the 2008 uprisings, I was involved in the Tibet movement at the time, of course, and I do remember what you said, that at the time China was quite shocked, about these uprisings. They had developed this narrative that, if they increased the economic, gains for Tibetans, force Tibetans to become, modern, develop, this sort of thing, that Tibetans would be happy to be living under Chinese rule, and I think, and they had convinced themselves, I think, that it was only older Tibetans who were angry about, the occupation of Tibet by China because they were remembering days before, and then, but what we saw in 2008 and since then has been, young Tibetans en masse, young Tibetans, rising up and speaking out. And I think that China thought that it could capture the hearts and minds of these young Tibetans. But what has been shown time and time again is that actually that has failed, that experiment. They've never been able to capture the hearts and minds of young Tibetans, and Tibetans have always, are continuing this spirit of resilience and resistance, even under such extreme occupation. In Tibet, how does it manifest, in terms of China monitoring Tibetans and things like that? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I would say post-2008 uprising, the surveillance and monitoring at the grassroots has intensified so much. And especially when President Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, a lot of grassroots surveillance and monitoring policies were rolled out, including dividing local villages into, grid style, into blocks that would technically make government possible or more easier to monitor people living in those areas, and then also introducing this convenient police post in each villages, so that every people living in that locality are being monitored, and then also monitored not just physically but also digitally on the devices as well. So regularly being monitored is a reality. It's becoming more and more dangerous in recent years. Yeah. So coming back to the statement that you raised about how they kind of failed to win the hearts and minds despite all of this repression, I think speaks really true to the situation in Tibet today, because the kind of policies that they are really bringing into Tibet basically shows that they've not been successful in silencing Tibetans, right? Because these policies, more and more repressive policies, are being continuously rolled out in Tibetan areas. So I think that's very telling that they've in fact failed to silence. Yeah.
It's a little bit ironic, I think, because the more that China represses Tibetans in Tibet and cuts off any possibility of communication with their families or the diaspora outside, the more it proves the point that Tibetans in Tibet are not happy, because, they continue to resist and rise up. And, China, I guess, can no longer make this argument that it is being, influenced by the West or driven by the West, because they've effectively cut people off from, that stream. So I think, in a kind of ironic way, they're actually proving that Tibetans are genuinely just unhappy with occupation and oppression, as everybody would be, and that no matter how long they, remain in Tibet, they won't be able to, subdue the Tibetans into being Chinese people and being happy. I just wanted to talk about, also you raised a minute ago, the escalation of transnational repression, and that we've seen, even just this year, a case that we believe to be extrajudicial killing. Can you speak a little bit more about that case and how this is just such a alarming escalation, of the issue?
I think the recent case about Tukuhunga Doji Rinpoche's assassination in Vietnam under the custody of both the Chinese government and the Vietnamese authorities, I think is one of the worst forms of transnational repression. And I think it really reminds us, not just our own community, but also to the international government, that these issues needs to be really addressed more openly, publicly, and that the perpetrators of these kind of transnational repression needs to be held accountable. Because the other forms of transnational repression, including intimidation, harassment, hacking, and monitoring, has been in place for many years, in fact decades. We've seen Tibetans being coerced into silence because of, severing of contacts between Tibetans inside and outside, and also Chinese government really infiltrating our own community to collect personal information of Tibetans who are involved politically in exile, and then using those information to further sort of disrupt the unity amongst the Tibetan community, and also alongside really also trying to undermine the livelihoods of Tibetans who have family members inside. So I think if you look at the the chronology of events, especially when it comes to Chinese government using these repression tactics, I think the recent case only highlights the urgency to act more proactively on this issue. And also, I think in December last year, we also saw one of the first sort of international sanctioning done by Chinese government against a Tibetan advocacy organization in Canada, right? Yeah. The Canada-Tibet Committee, its members were targeted and was formally sanctioned by Chinese government for their advocacy work in Canada, for instance. So I think these are very clear that the Chinese government is not really, has not really stopped its repression tactics abroad. It's only intensifying, and that we need more concrete actions to tackle that.
Yes, I think for Australia Tibet Council, one of the first things we've been doing is just, obviously trying to educate the government and get them to take this issue seriously. Tibetan Australians, I mean, there's been Tibetans in Australia now for decades, and the Tibetan community is growing here. And I think in a kind of simplistic way, the government just thought, oh, well, if you allow Tibetans to resettle in Australia, they'll be able to enjoy the freedom that we have in Australia. But actually, more and more Tibetans have said to me personally that even though they live in Australia, they cannot fully be free in Australia because, if they attend a protest or speak out about China, or even tell their personal story, because many people who come to Australia are former political prisoners when they were in Tibet. They say that, if they do that, then they're putting their family members at risk, And so I think what you just raised is really important, the need for the Australian government and governments around the world to really take this issue seriously. What are the kind of things that you think that they should be doing to show that they are trying to protect Tibetans, and allow them to have their freedom?
So before I speak on what kind of actions the government could take, I would want to speak a little bit about the impact it has, the transnational repression it has in the Tibetan community, right? So because of transnational repression happening against the diaspora community, especially on the Tibetans, I think it imposes a lot of difficulty psychologically in the mental well-being. A lot of Tibetans, especially former political prisoners who have endured so much in China, and now even after escaping China's repression, they continue to still deal with a lot of stress, anxiety, and trauma that really makes them difficult to live life, with dignity or with so much of assurance, right? And on the other hand, some of the impact that we're also seeing in the community is because of this use of collective punishment, the Chinese government, a lot of Tibetans are isolating themselves, both politically and socially, by not getting involved in activism. There have been instances in the past of Tibetans who have refused to sort of run for prominent positions in the community because them being, in the public eye would make Chinese government uncomfortable, ultimately threatening their family members back home. So that's basically a lot of isolation, and both socially and politically we're seeing in Tibetan community, and also undermining or really trying to sabotage the diaspora networks that we have built outside for so many years, right? When the government tries to sort of harass you on a regular basis and intimidate you, it will really sort of put a lot of pressure on that individual to really deal with that internally. And it takes a toll on them, really. And then it makes it difficult for them to fully engage more actively in the movement. So ultimately, the goal for the Chinese government is to cut off that, that will to do.
if a person, withdraws, decides to not participate in their community, decides to not, like you say, do the roles that they could do, in advocacy groups, then really China's won. If a Tibetan person withdraws themselves from that public space, it's been a very effective use of transnational repression if that's the result, yeah.
And the sole reason why Tibetans flee Tibet into these free countries is because they believe that they'll be able to exercise their fundamental rights of expression, assembly, movement freely. But really it's not the case in today's time, right? A lot of people in Australia, especially the Tibetans and other ethnic minorities living in Australia, for instance, in Europe, are not able to exercise that because they feel they're being constantly monitored and watched, and really limits their mobility and their expression, really makes life even outside in a free democratic country difficult. Yeah. So I think ultimately transnational repression is not just the issue for the diaspora communities. I think it's more about the state's sovereignty, and also states, governments should be more sort of active in trying to protect their own values that they really hold, right? That they're known for. The values of freedom, dignity, justice, all of that needs to be upheld.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And like you say, I think that's where the responsibility lies, the government needs to step up their protections of Tibetans, and understand, how they can help Tibetans to either navigate or mitigate these threats, and like you say, bring people who are responsible for this to have repercussions there. Because at the moment, all this activity that China's doing, they are doing it with full impunity, you know what I mean? They feel like they can get away with it because they do get away with it. There is no impact. So we've been advocating to the Australian government to effectively use Australian sanction laws. We have in this country Magnitsky style sanctions, which can be applied to individuals, individuals who have proven to violate human rights. And at the moment, Australia has not issued a single Magnitsky sanction for any CCP official, which is astounding given the number of human rights violations that are occurring in Tibet. So obviously we'll continue to do advocacy with the Australian government and try to get them to move on this issue and actually hold some of these officials to account for their activities. Aside from that, I think we also are talking to some other government agencies about, because some of this stuff is actually just, illegal, you know what I mean, threatening people, obviously. And they need to do more to make sure that Tibetans living in Australia and around the world feel protected. And increasingly, I think one of the concerns is when people travel, because like you said, it was a collaboration between Vietnamese police and Chinese police earlier in the year that saw this horrific escalation to an extrajudicial killing. And so really I think there needs to be a way that Tibetans can feel safe if they moved through other countries, like Thailand, Southeast Asia, Vietnam. Yeah. And obviously Nepal has become increasingly unsafe.
Yeah, speaking of travel, I would say Chinese government in recent years have introduced this 15-day free visa policy, right? With a lot of European countries, and I think also with Australia. I think it's a 30-day visit now. Yeah. So that free visa policy, in fact, has not been really free when it comes to the Tibetan community members. So Tibetans, we have had instances in Europe and even in Australia who have used that policy to travel to Tibet to meet their long sort of cut off family members, to reunite with their family members. But we have had a lot of instances of Tibetans who were being deported back to their countries because of their involvement in, where they're living, right? So I think that's really concerning. And some of them have had interrogated at the airports, their phone devices, personal devices checked and, searched, which is really undermines their own rights as individuals. So this is growing more and more common, and I think governments should be talking more about this to protecting their citizens.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I'm getting more and more accounts and people telling us of their accounts. We're talking about, of course, even for Tibetans and for anybody, myself, journalists, diplomats, to travel into Tibet is still restricted. Even with the 30-day free visa to China, you still have to apply for a special permit to travel to Tibet. So a lot of Tibetans might be traveling back to meet family knowing that they won't be able to potentially go to, you know, the village where they were born, the place where they were raised, and they have to try to arrange with their family to meet them in another place in China. And yeah, we're seeing families being detained for hours and hours, 5 hours, 12 hours. We're seeing, as you said, Australian Tibetans. So these are Tibetans travelling who have become Australian citizens, travelling with Australian documents, Australian passports, being detained and deported back to Australia. And I really think that this is something that the Australian Embassy needs to start taking responsibility for. You know, documenting this. How many times is it occurring? And then finding a practical way that they can assist Tibetans who are being caught in this. You know, it seems almost redundant to say that it shouldn't be illegal to travel to see your family, you know, and to see your family. And many of these people haven't seen their family members for decades and decades, and, you know, are very much looking forward to a reunion, but are finding that, you know, it's just impossible because of the oppression of China, you know. And yeah, so Australian Embassy needs to do more. Obviously, like you said, this is happening to people and Tibetans in Europe, Tibetans in, I guess, the Americas as well. You know, it's not just a, so perhaps there needs to be a multilateral or coordinated effort, you know. We saw, I think in America, they had, they passed a bill called the Reciprocal Access Bill, and we actually saw, I believe, last year where some Chinese officials were given a visa sanction from America because they were refusing entry for Tibetans, which I guess is a good start. There probably needs to be much, much more of that. You know, have you done advocacy like this? You said that you've taken some advocacy to the UN. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, your experience there, and if that's a hopeful pathway or not?
Yes, because we are a research organization, we believe documentation is key when it's trying to build, bring in accountability and attention on a lot of these human rights issues. So we submit regular cases of political prisoners who've been disappeared, or who've been tortured, who've been killed in custody. So we bring these cases to the attention of the special procedures. So these special procedures would then take on these cases to communicate with Chinese government to ask more information about these allegations. Because inside Tibet, you do not really have a domestic recourse to do that. So we make sure that we document these cases whenever we get them, and then we try to verify them and then submit it to the UN special procedures so that the cases of these individuals do not go unnoticed at the UN level. And on the other hand, we also actively sort of submit reports to the UN committees against torture, rights of the child, against racial discrimination, because these are some of the conventions that the Chinese government has signed and has been a party to. And becoming so a state ratifying these conventions have an obligation to sort of carry out these obligations, right, in their own countries. So we, as part of our research, we would document cases under these issues and then submit reports to the UN so that it gets highlighted at the UN level. Yeah.
And I mean, I think in my experience, I found that submitting things to the UN does have an impact on China. For the most part, they tend to just sort of dismiss or ignore, you know, any criticism of them. But then they also retaliate, like you said, against the Canadian Tibet Committee and others. So they obviously are very sensitive to this criticism, you know. So I think we can say that it does have an impact, you know, UN work. It's very difficult though, making any representation to the UN or anything, getting in the door, I imagine is really difficult. Yeah.
And also the spaces in UN is also kind of becoming more and more unsafe for human rights defenders to participate there fully, because the presence of Chinese government infiltration and their people within the confines of the UN building is also very, very there. And we have felt it. And I think a lot of other Tibetan and other Chinese human rights defenders have felt it. And I think that's also something that the institutions like the UN should be taking more cognizance about.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really pleased that your organisation, Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy, was able to send you to Australia to work with the Australia-Tibet Council and the Tibetan community to do some training. Can you speak a bit more about what you were trying to help Tibetans here in Australia in the community to learn or understand about transnational repression?
Mm-hmm. So since the launch of our report in February last year, and also through the course of the research into the report on transnational repression of Tibetan diaspora communities, I think we felt a realization that a lot of awareness needs to be raised, not just in the international community and governments, but also amongst our own community on how to best counter Chinese transnational repression. Because the phenomenon has, like I said before, is not new, which is why a lot of Tibetans in the community have normalized this phenomenon, which is problematic, right? Which is why we want to raise the severity of this issue amongst our community. So that's why we started a series of awareness-raising activities in a lot of Tibetan, in countries where a lot of Tibetan diasporas are based. So in countries in Europe, in North America, and also now today in Australia. Mm-hmm. So last week we met with the Tibetan community members here in Sydney, and we talked about the findings of the report and how best the community can respond on when they face repression of this nature, right? Mm-hmm. So we've had a representative, an officer from the Australian Federal Police come to the community workshop where they basically talked about how Australian government views transnational repression or foreign interference.
They term it foreign interference.
They term it foreign interference. So how they approach foreign interference and how if an affected individual continues to face these forms of tactics, how they can go about reporting to the federal police. So that has been really useful because at the moment, unfortunately, a lot of governments in Europe, for instance, do not have a hotline number or a dedicated mechanism to report these kind of repression, right? So that is a good example for other governments to also follow. And also alongside the community awareness raising activities, we also are trying to engage with lawmakers and policymakers to take on more concrete actions on countering Chinese transnational repression, because ultimately this is not an issue of the ethnic minorities or the diaspora communities, but also their values, their sovereignty being undermined by an authoritarian country like China. Yeah. So yeah, we're basically here to remind the government to take more concrete actions.
Yeah, as you said, here in Australia, when we talk to the government, we use the term China's transnational repression of Tibetans, but they want to think of it in terms of foreign interference. So China's, interference in Australian life and threatening Australian citizens, which many Tibetans have become Australian citizens, and that's fine if they want to term it that way, and like you say, frame it in the way of like a security issue. Then at least on the one hand, they're starting to understand the depth and the threats that are there. So in conclusion, I just want to ask you, what can people do? Obviously, they can start off by reading your report and understanding, the depth of the situation. But what else would you say people can do to, try to help themselves or help, the Tibetan community to get through this?
So I think the international community can really sort of start maybe working more with the Tibetan community and basically trying to understand more about Tibet and its history, because we're dealing at a time when the Chinese government is really sort of intensifying its approach when it comes to spreading disinformation and propaganda internationally. So with invent of AI and a lot of technologies that are coming also out of China, this really poses a danger amongst the minds of the international community that could really submit to the Chinese disinformation tactics and distortion of history and the reality of the Tibetans inside. So what international community could really do is try to understand and involve more with the Tibetan community and other affected communities and understand their real issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so start by, reading your report, engaging in the information you're putting out. Also, I guess, if you're based in Australia, following Australia Tibet Council, because we'll be keeping people up to date with this and our campaign and how we're trying to affect change within the government. And so I just guess like following that and continuing to put the pressure on governments, the Tibetan community here in Australia is growing, and that's wonderful. But also, I think it will take Australians to also step up and say, this is an issue that they think the government should be taking seriously and involving themselves in the campaign in that way. So that'd be wonderful. So yeah, I just want to say, thank you very much to you, Tenzin Dawa, the executive director of Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy. Thank you for coming to Australia. Thank you for taking up this advocacy here and working with ATC, Australia Tibet Council. We really appreciate all that you're bringing to our campaigns and to speaking about this issue to the Tibetan community in Australia and to the Australian government. So, yeah.